raise your right hand. You solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes, I do.
You may proceed.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon, sir.
Of course, you testified here before the jury before today, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you're placed back under oath, so your testimony will be as well, testimony under oath. We had begun a conversation with your last testimony that talked about the ongoing investigation that you were in charge of regarding this case. You were the chief investigating officer, correct?
Yes, sir.
Did there come a time that you met with Tracy Martin and his girlfriend, Brandy Green, in your office?
Yes, sir, there was.
Do you recall about how many days after the event of the shooting that was?
It was either the day after or the day after the walkthrough. I think it was on the 28th.
Okay. What was the purpose of you bringing Mr. Martin and Miss Green to your office?
To bring him up to speed as far as the progress of the investigation and where we were at that point.
Okay. They had some concerns, did they not, as to whether or not Mrs. Zimmerman at that point had been arrested?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And were you sharing with them your progress and what was done and what still needed to be done?
Yes, sir.
And can you outline the setting where you were when you had this conversation with the two of them?
We conducted a meeting in the conference room that we have in the police department on the second floor. And and after that, I went ahead and played the 911 recordings for him.
Okay. Do you recall where that recording took place?
It was at my desk.
Okay. And that was, as testified to by a previous officer, sort of a cubby hole set up with 2 or 3 other desks in the close proximity?
Yes, sir.
And can you then tell the jury how that was set up, where you were sitting, where Mr. Martin was sitting if he was, and where Ms. Green was sitting?
Okay, I was seated in front of my desk facing my computer monitor. Mr. Martin was to my rear left, and next to him was his girlfriend or fiance, Brandy, and kind of like in that posture.
Okay. So if I'm sitting at my screen right here, you were sitting down?
Yes, sir.
Tracy Martin then was just over your left shoulder?
Yes, sir.
And then Brandy Green just behind or next to him?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And what was the focus at that point?
The audio portions of the recording that I was playing on my computer.
Okay. We know, and I want to focus you on what we have shorthand called the Lauer 911 call. Do you understand what I mean by that?
Yes, sir.
And that is the call that has the screams on it and the gunshot?
Yes, sir.
And did you play that for Mr. Martin and Ms. Green?
Yes, sir. I played all the recordings for him.
Okay. Focusing on the 911 call, we just talked about the Lauer 911 call. Tell me how you played that, what volume, or how the setting of that occurred.
I can't recall the number as far as the volume went, but it was audible, relatively clear, as clear as I had. It was played off of I believe off of a CD. It might have been digital or an email. I don't quite remember, but it was played, and it was audible.
Okay. And what was Mr. Martin's response?
Emotional, understandingly so. And I let him listen first.
I'm sorry? I
let him listen first before I asked anything.
Okay. And what did you ask him?
I believe my words were, is that your son's voice in the background? Or something. I think I said a little differently than that, but I inquired as if that was, in fact, his son yelling for help.
And what was his response?
It was more of a verbal and nonverbal. He looked away and under his breath, as I interpreted, said no.
Did he ever ask that the tape be played for him again that time?
I don't believe so.
Did he ever evidence to you any concern with being able to hear the tape?
No, sir.
Had that occurred, would you have simply played the tape for him the second time?
Absolutely, sir.
And Miss Green, what was her response?
She was consoling him. I didn't hear a response from her.
Did you ask her specifically whether or not she believed it to be Trayvon Martin's voice?
No, sir, I did not.
Did she offer any opinion voluntarily as to whether or not she believed it was Trayvon Martin's voice?
None that I recall, no, sir.
Do you know who else was present in the area sort of nearby, within, let's say, earshot of the playing of the call?
One of our sergeants was behind us. He was walking through. I guess he saw what I was doing, and he took it upon himself to stop, and I believe that was the only person that I saw.
Do you recall what that sergeant's name was?
Sergeant Leon Ciesla.
Nothing further on.
Thank you, Cross.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon, sir.
Let's talk about the last thing you mentioned. Sergeant Ciesla was walking by, or you believe stopped, is that correct?
Yeah, no, he stopped, yes.
Okay, and Detective or Investigator Singleton wasn't around as best you can recall, is that correct?
No, sir.
She was not, correct?
No, I didn't see her there.
Okay. Now, I assume by the nature of your profession that this is one of the most difficult things you have to do,
By far, sir, yes, it is.
to have to talk about the death of a loved one to a parent.
Yes, sir, it was.
Is there anything more difficult that you have to deal with as an investigator in a case involving the death of a person?
Other than an initial notification, probably not.
And I gather you try to, as best you can, to be as sensitive as you can, realizing how sensitive this issue is, or how traumatic an event it can be, correct?
Yes, sir.
And did you attempt to do that as best you could?
Yes, sir, I did.
Okay. I gather you informed Trayvon Martin's dad that you were going to have him listen to some recordings?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Did you tell him ahead of time that there would actually be a shot? In other words, that he would actually listen to the death of his son? In other words, did you tell him ahead of time?
I don't recall specifically informing him of that, no.
Okay. But you played, I think you said 5 or 6 911 calls, is that correct?
Every one that I had, yes, sir.
Okay. And at this time, do you recall the order or how you played them, other than you played them all?
I don't recall the order, but yes, I played them all.
And would you agree that some of those recordings, such as Ms. Serdika's, was gut-wrenching, in other words, for a parent to have to listen to when they're talking about the death of their son?
Yes, sir.
Okay, they were pretty emotional.
Yes, sir.
And would you agree that Mr. Martin's reaction was appropriate in the sense of having to relive that, even though he wasn't there, but having to, again, understand that his son was no longer among us? In other words, that his son was dead in heaven, hopefully.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And would you agree that he reacted appropriately to that?
Yes, sir.
So you played the recording in which Ms. Serdika is, and the jury's listened to him, so I'm not going to play it again, but she's describing the death of this kid, or describing what she heard, whatever it was. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And then you're playing other recordings in which other people are describing what they saw, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And I gather as you're playing this, Mr. Martin's getting very emotional. Would that be fair?
Yes, sir.
Was he having a hard time dealing with this?
In my opinion, yes, sir.
Okay. And I gather he didn't say, hey, hold on, this is too difficult for me. Let me come back another day. He went ahead and said, I'm going to listen to everything, because he wanted to know what was going on in the case. Would that be fair?
Yes, sir.
And from your perspective, that was very understandable, correct?
Absolutely, yes,
I mean,
sir.
his son has been killed, 2 days earlier, correct?
Yes.
And he's wanting some answers, as any parent should want. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Yes, sir.
Wasn't that reasonable on his part?
Yes, sir, it was.
That next thing he knows, he gets home and his son's is missing, and then he realizes his son's dead.
Yes, sir.
And it's not just from natural causes. Somebody has shot him in the chest.
Let me object, Your Honor, outside the scope of direct examination.
I think this is pertinent to the issue that I'm trying to establish, the scenario that Mr.
We'll then get
Martin.
to your next question, please.
Yes. In other words, Did you preface any of this? I know this is going to be very difficult for you, but please try to listen to all these recordings. I'm assuming you did that because you're a police officer's been around the block a lot of times.
I believe I did, yes, sir.
Okay. And he, even though realizing it was going to be emotional, said, I'll try to listen through this and try to go through it?
Yes, sir, he did.
Okay. And as he's listening through this, is the emotion kind of building up? Do you see that building up?
It was a very emotional moment, yes, sir.
Okay. And then you played, at some point, the recording of the screams for help, correct?
Yes, sir, I did, yes.
But also in that recording, there's actually a gunshot, correct?
Yes, there is.
Okay. And I gather you played, as a good investigator, you played all the recordings from beginning to end, correct?
Yes, sir.
So that there would be no issue about what was going on, that you actually were thorough in your attempting to tell Mr. Martin what had happened.
My objective was to share all the information I had with him.
Okay. So you were providing all those recordings?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And I gather he's listening to these cries, and then he hears the gunshot, correct? And
Yes,
then you
sir.
keep playing it, right?
Yes, sir.
And I guess it was obvious in the way you were playing it that we were talking about his son having been shot.
Correct.
I mean,
yes, sir.
was there any dispute about that?
No, sir, there was not.
That he understood that that was the death of his son?
Yes, sir.
And I gather you being as sensitive as you can based on these circumstances. Well, I'm assuming it was emotional for you, too.
It was trying for me, yes, it was.
Okay. And obviously being a good investigator, police officer, having done this for a long time, you were trying to be as sensitive as you could in dealing with the death of a young boy that the father was there, in other words.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And then at some point you had to ask him some questions about the identification of the voice, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you, as best as you could, even though you knew Mr. Martin was upset and emotional, you still felt you had a need to ask him at that point, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And I think you asked him something to the effect, do you recognize the voice? Or do I have it right, or am I misstating what you said?
It was either do you recognize the voice or is that your son's voice in the background?
Okay. And as this was going on, when you specifically asked him that, I think you described Mr. Martin and his head was down, correct?
It was more like looking away from me and the computer.
Like he didn't even want to deal with it. Is
Yes,
that how
sir.
you interpreted it?
Yes, sir.
And then you stated that it was under his breath, I gather, right? Did I get that right?
Yes, sir.
And you interpreted it as he said no, correct?
Yes, sir.
I mean, you didn't flat out hear the word no unequivocally, or did you hear it like something under his breath and he was distraught?
I heard it and saw the movement of his mouth.
Okay, so you believe, your opinion is that he said no?
Yes, sir, it is.
Now, do you know if that no was directed to the fact that you had just played literally not a videotape of his son's death, but an audio tape, or was it related to the identification of the voice? Do you know?
We object, Your Honor, that would be speculation of this witness.
Sustained.
Would you agree that when you asked him that, that was after you had played the recording in which you were asking him to identify the voice, but in that same recording, he was hearing for the first time, right, the death of his son,
Yes, sir.
right? As
Yes.
far as you know, he had never heard this shooting before in terms of his son being killed.
Yes, this was prior before it was released, so it had to have been the first time.
Okay. If I may have a moment, Your Honor. And sir, I gather in all your years of doing this, when people are hearing about the death of a loved one, even when you go like to the door, when you go to their house or something, most people, they react like, oh no, like my God, something's happened, their son or loved one is no longer among that, is that a normal thing that people, or do people just react, oh, okay, no big deal?
It's extreme grief, so yes, that is typical.
And the word no is like, I can't believe it, like he's dead. Isn't that a normal
Objection,
thing?
that would be speculation.
It's based upon what his experience has been, so in that regard, I'll allow it.
Right? It's normal for, when you're telling them about the death of a loved one, people say, no, I can't believe it, that kind of stuff.
It could be construed as denial.
Right?
Yes, sir.
And that would be a normal thing based on your experience when people say no, correct?
Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir. No further questions.
Thank you. Redirect?
Yes, please. When you talked about doing all of the 911 calls, you played all those 911 calls, correct? But
Yes,
it
sir.
was only after, and specifically after you played the Lauer 911 call, that you looked at Mr. Martin and asked if that was the voice of his son screaming in the background, correct?
It was the most graphic, yes, sir.
Right. And it was right at that precise time because you wanted to know what he thought of the voice on the tape, didn't you?
Objection, leading question.
What was the purpose of asking him?
To clarify that it was, in fact, if it was or if it wasn't his son's voice.
Right, because that was significant to your investigation, correct?
Yes, sir. it
You were
was.
doing it, as Mr. De Leon said, as sensitively as you could, but it was something you had to do as the chief investigator.
Yes, sir.
Because you knew that if Trayvon Martin's father had said
Objection
what
is the leading question.
Okay, you need to rephrase your question.
was it significant in your investigation that Mr. Martin said it was not the voice of his son?
It became significant in the investigation because at that point in time, there really wasn't much of a dispute at that time of where that voice came from.
Because it was your understanding in your investigation that other information, well, let me ask you this. What other information supported that was George Zimmerman screaming?
Objection is to hearsay now.
Only to the extent that he was the chief investigating officer, Your Honor. He,
No speaking objections,
Sorry.
please. Overruled.
It was statements that I obtained from the initial responding officers, coupled with statements provided by an eyewitness. You want names or?
sure.
Okay, Officer Tim Smith, statements that he had heard the defendant make, and John Good, who at that point had provided me with the statement, both in writing and I believe taped also, that it was his belief that it was George Zimmerman the one yelling for help.
So, with that information in mind, you were presenting this to Mr. Martin with what idea? What did you want to accomplish by presenting this to Mr. Martin and having him listen to it?
For my own clarification, to make sure that everybody had it correct, or at that point, information that I had was correct.
And did that information, did Mr. Martin's response fit into the other information you already had available?
At that point in time, yes, sir, it did.
And to the extent that he said no, you understood that to be what? When he said no, what question do you think he was answering?
That the voice in the background was not that of his son's.
Did he ever contact you in the days or weeks after that to ask you whether or not he could listen to the tape again?
No, sir, he did not.
Did he ever say anything to you about, I want to change my mind, and I want to listen to it again to see anything else about that tape?
No, sir.
Did you question directly Ms. Green in regard to her thought as to whose voice that was?
Not that I recall, sir, no.
Did she counter or contest Tracy Martin's acknowledgement that it was not his son's voice?
Objection calls for hearsay and also an assumption on the part of Ms. Green.
I'll rephrase it.
That the objection sustained.
Did Ms. Green counter, did she say anything that evidenced to you as the investigator that she disagreed with Mr. Martin?
No, sir.
Though it was undoubtedly a very emotional time for Mr. Martin and also for you, do you have any concern that he understood your question and that he answered it by saying no?
No, sir.
Thank you. Nothing further.
You were asked about information you had prior to that,
Yes, sir.
and you mentioned Mr. Good, correct?
Yes,
You
sir.
mentioned Mr. Good, and you mentioned the defendant, Mr. Zimmerman, correct?
I didn't mention Mr. Zimmerman. That was independent of Mr. Zimmerman.
Okay, you mentioned Tim Smith,
Yes, sir.
that he had actually heard the call, or he just said, this is what Mr. Zimmerman said?
Yes.
Okay, right?
Yes, based on what Mr. Zimmerman said to Officer Smith.
Right, and you recall when you played that recording to Mr. Zimmerman, that Mr. Zimmerman said, it doesn't sound like me. You recall that?
Yes, I did.
In terms of you played that 911 call and he told you, it doesn't sound like me, correct?
I believe his words were, that doesn't even sound like me, quote unquote.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. And finally, sir, you were asked about Miss Green, who you knew as the fiancée or girlfriend of Mr. Martin, right?
Yes, sir.
And would you agree that she was consoling Mr. Martin, correct?
Yes, sir.
So in terms of what she said, she heard or not, she was focusing on providing whatever comfort she could
Yes, sir.
to the father of the father of Trayvon Martin.
Yes, sir.
Would that be accurate?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, I gather in all your experience, you've never had a recording such as this where you don't just have a voice, but you also have the shooting itself all in one recording, or have you had that before?
No, this is the first.
That's the first time?
Yes, sir.
So it was pretty emotionally draining for you two, I'm assuming, having to play that for the victim's dad.
That and the circumstances surrounding the entire incident. Yes, sir.
There's not really a SOP or any kind of written directive in the police logbook or whatever, or case book on how to deal with things like this, is there?
Other than calling for spiritual assistance and support, but at that point in time, that interview or that debriefing or that briefing of the family, there is no that I'm aware of.
And I gather in the reaction of Mr. Martin, you kind of sensed what he was going through too.
Oh, yes, sir.
Was it obvious?
Very much so.
Thank you, sir.
Were you direct?
Only on the one issue that was just brought up. When Mr. Zimmerman said to you in the challenge interview that you had with him, doesn't even sound like me, remember that, just brought up by Mr. Del Rionda?
Yes, sir.
You did not take that as an indication that Mr. Zimmerman was denying that it was him on the voice, did
Objection,
you?
leading question.
Sustained.
Did you, when Mr. Zimmerman said that to you, what indication did that give to you?
As typical as somebody hearing their voice on recording, a lot of people don't recognize their own voices. It's a little bit different hearing it than how it sounds when you're speaking it.
Within the context of your investigation, did you accept that to be a denial by Mr. Zimmerman that it was actually his voice?
No,
Or
sir.
just that he didn't recognize his own voice?
I didn't take it as a denial, and I took it as him not recognizing his own voice.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. May Officer Serino be excused?
At this time, subject to recall.
Okay, you're excused, but subject to being recalled. Thank you, sir. Call your next witness, please.
Recall Doris Singleton.
So the lead detective has retaken.
Green in your office.
Yes, sir, there was.
Do you recall about how many days after the event of the shooting that was?
It was either the day after or the day after the walkthrough. I think it was on the 28th.
Okay. What was the purpose of you bringing Mr. Martin and Miss Green to your office?
To bring him up to speed as far as the progress of the investigation and where we were at that point.
Okay. They had some concerns, did they not, as to whether or not Mrs. Zimmerman at that point forward today, correct?
Yes, sir.
And placed back under oath, so your testimony will be as well, testimony under oath. We had begun a conversation with your last testimony that talked about the ongoing investigation that you were in charge of regarding this case. You were the chief investigating officer, correct?
Yes, sir.
Did there come a time that you met with Tracy Martin and his girlfriend, Brandy Groin, had been arrested?
Yes, sir.
And were you sharing with them your progress and what was done and what still needed to be done?
Yes, sir.
And can you outline the setting, where you were when you had this conversation with the two of them?
We conducted a meeting in the conference room that we have in the police department on the second floor. And and after that, I went ahead and played the 911 recordings for him.
Okay, do you recall where that playing of that recording took place?
It was at my desk.
Okay. And that was, as testified to by a previous officer, sort of a cubby hole set up with 2 or 3 other desks in the close proximity?
Yes, sir.
And can you then tell the jury how that was set up, where you were sitting, where Mr. Martin was sitting if he was, and where Ms. Green was sitting?
Okay, I was seated in front of my desk facing my computer monitor.
Would you raise your right hand? You solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes, I do.
You may proceed.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon, sir.
Of course, you testified here before the jury